"Look at the stars," he said, staring into her dark brown eyes. She turned around. "I saw nothing," she replied. He moved closer to her then. He raised her chin a bit higher so she could see as he created a more focused view. Her eyes widened as her slim plump lips slightly opened. It was obvious Elizabeth was not ready to leave the farm anytime soon, as she could not turn away from the vibrancy of the stars. It was at that moment she wondered, what if such vibrancy was transcended through us on earth? Then he whispered, "What if that vibrancy in all its glory is within you?" She turned looking at him in awe. Then he smiled and said to her, "We are what we choose to believe. We are only limited by our own thoughts and imagination. If only we would pay the sacrifices in discovering who we are, and what we are capable of creating, only then can we stand the test of fate." "Test of fate," Elizabeth replied as she realized it was past her curfew. Elizabeth picked up her keg of milk and ran off telling Eric goodbye. As Elizabeth got in that night wondering if Eric was attracted to her, Elizabeth was getting really attracted to how inspiring and sweet he was. "His words are so soothing," she said as she reminisced in bed. Eric and Elizabeth had been friends for quite some time, ever since he came into the neighborhood with his sister Jennifer, and she also admired Eric's artwork as a painter. A few moments later, there was a knock on the door. It was Elizabeth's aunty, whom Elizabeth loved dearly. "Elizabeth dear, it is just a few days to your engagement to Mr. Jide," Elizabeth sadly replied with a nod as her aunt left her room. Aunt Diane had arranged her future by choosing a wealthy suitor for Elizabeth because she could not stand to continue to fend for her, while Elizabeth had accepted the unknown stranger as a duty to be fulfilled to pay her aunt back for raising her ever since she was orphaned. Later on that day, Eric came to visit, and Elizabeth was excited to see Eric, while her aunt was displeased about Eric's presence. In pretense, she instructed Elizabeth to serve him some biscuits and tea. As Eric was having his snacks, a deliveryman came by for Aunt Diane. Aunt Diane was eager to meet with the deliveryman, and this made Elizabeth wonder what she was trying to hide. As Aunt Diane attends to the deliveryman, she only gets a note that reads, "Meet me at the market square at 10 p.m. Then she hurriedly hides the note, not wanting Elizabeth and Eric to find out what she is hiding. Meanwhile, Eric was staring at Elizabeth all the while as he thought to himself when would be the proper time to finally reveal his feelings to her. Eric had always wanted Elizabeth completely comfortable with him before he opened up to her about how he felt, since he only met her a few weeks ago. "I will be on my way now," Eric says as he stands to take his leave. He thanks Aunt Diane for having him and also smiles at Elizabeth as he takes his leave. As Eric had left, Aunt Diane asked Elizabeth about her friend Amina. Elizabeth was surprised because Aunt Diane never liked Amina. "Oh, I have not seen her around today. Is there a problem, Aunt?" Elizabeth asked. "I was wondering if you might want to spend some time with her, especially now that your engagement is near. I am sure you girls have a lot to catch up on," Aunt Diane said as she thought to herself she had to keep Elizabeth distracted so she could meet with her date. As Aunt Diane arrived at the market square, she heard a voice right behind her. "It is good you are here on time. I was beginning to lose my patience," he said. "I am here now, but I did not expect you to be in town. What brings you so early?" she asked inquisitively. I am here for my bride. I gave you more than enough time already and you still haven't been able to make her agree to marry me. I give you 48 hours or the deal is off. You won't get any of my gold mine. And Diane tries to appease him. Everything is going just fine. In fact, it is good you are in town because now she can finally meet you. Good night, miss, the stranger said as he walked away. And Diane hurried home to make sure Elizabeth was prepared for her first date with the stranger the following night. The stranger stopped by at the bar to have a drink and catch up on his favorite game ongoing that night. To his surprise, he heard a familiar voice sitting right next to him. Eric, he called, surprised to see his old-time friend from the university days, as they both hugged and greeted each other and made a toast to a pleasant reunion. Meanwhile, Aunt Diane hastens Elizabeth to be prepared for her date and asks her to try on her new outfits, but Elizabeth is sad. All she can think of is Eric. After Elizabeth had tried on her outfits, she went to meet Amina, her friend, to console her. Amina suggested she tell Eric how she felt about him. Perhaps he would be able to put an end to this once and for all, as she was sure Eric was into Elizabeth as well. I believe in the power of love and I know Eric loves you too. I have seen how he looks at you and how often he always wants to be around you. It is too late for that now, Elizabeth replied. But Amina is determined to tell Eric all that is going on with Elizabeth, so she set out to meet with Eric. On getting to Eric's home, she had seen him from afar, but Eric had no idea as a little boy arrived with some paintbrushes in his hands that Eric had sent the boy to get him. Eric exploded with intense anger at the little boy. I told you the specific brushes to get me. What are these? Eric threw away the brushes the little boy had bought for him. Amina was surprised. She had never seen Eric like that before. He is temperamental, she whispered to herself. The idea of Eric and her friend Elizabeth quickly vanished, so she thought Elizabeth should not be with Eric. Eric's sister Jennifer had come by to see her brother. She embraced Eric with a hug and expressed how much she had missed him. Eric was happy to see his sister as she had been away from school, but she made it compulsory to check on Eric whenever she could because Eric was her only brother and she loved him dearly. Jennifer went into Eric's room to inspect his medication. Then she realized Eric had not been taking his medications. This made her teary as Eric walked to apologize and made a promise to take them when he should. Jennifer feared the warning from the psychiatrist concerning Eric's mental health. As Amina helped her friend prepare for her date, Amina did not mention what she had seen earlier concerning Eric. Elizabeth got set for her date and wished Amina a good night. As Elizabeth walked into the restaurant wondering in her heart who the stranger might be, the stranger called out her name. As Elizabeth looked the stranger in the eyes, it was Jide, Elizabeth's long-lost sweetheart Jide. Elizabeth got disappointed and stomped out of the restaurant as Jide tried to explain why he had been away for a long time. Meanwhile, Eric had been to Elizabeth's house the same night and Amina had mistakenly disclosed to Eric Elizabeth's date and where she was. Eric told Amina he was aware of the date and he was supposed to pick up Elizabeth, for he was worried for her safety as Elizabeth stomped out of the restaurant. Sighting Eric's car, she quickly got in and Eric drove off. As Eric drove, Elizabeth noticed his silence and wondered why he had not uttered a word to her. As they got to Eric's apartment, He angrily instructed Elizabeth to get out of his car. As Elizabeth was trying to grasp her head around what was happening, Eric gave her a slap, saying, "You had the guts to go on a date after all I have done for you," as Eric dragged her into the apartment. Elizabeth realized she had been blinded by his intention and his nature. Elizabeth began to plead with them to think about the good times they shared as friends, but Eric got more triggered and he beat her mercilessly until she was unconscious. As Amina was about to leave Elizabeth's house, realizing it was getting really late, Jide came by to make amends with Elizabeth. Then he introduced himself to Amina and explained all that had happened. He also opened up to her that the only way he could be with Elizabeth was to bribe Aunt Diane, seeing how desperate she was to give Elizabeth away. He explained that Aunt Diane would never allow him to be with his only true love. Jide explained that he never stopped writing to Elizabeth, but her aunt never let his letters get through to her, nor was Elizabeth able to write to him, and she thought he had forgotten about her in the city. Aunt Diane and my father had an affair in their early days, and she must have thought my father was going to marry her, but he married my mother before I was born. Ever since, Aunt Diane had hate in her heart towards anything that had to do with my father, Jide explained further. Amina felt pity for Jide as she suggested they both go in search of her where she knew she could be. As they both arrived at Eric's apartment, Jide stood out so as not to intrude, but as Amina went in to get her friend, Amina's scream drove Jide in hurriedly to know what had happened. Seeing Elizabeth beaten and unconscious and Eric getting more and more drunk, Jide couldn't believe his old-time friend had done this to Elizabeth, despite he was well aware of his plans for Elizabeth. In rage, Jide almost beat Eric to a stupor, but Amina kept pulling Jide off so the situation would not get as much worse as it already had. Then Jide carried Elizabeth and left with Amina to his apartment, while Jide called his doctor to come by the house so Elizabeth could be examined and taken care of. According to the doctor's report, Elizabeth had suffered a lot of internal injuries, which had made it impossible for her to walk at least for some weeks. The doctor advised Elizabeth to take as much rest as possible while she's being looked after. Aunt Diane was informed of Elizabeth's situation, but she advised Jide to take advantage of the situation by marrying her immediately. Jide refused and decided he would not take advantage of Elizabeth's situation. Instead, he would patiently wait for her recovery and see to it she is well, as well as treating Elizabeth to some chocolates and bouquets of flowers. One evening Jide got down on his knees and proposed to Elizabeth. Although Elizabeth was not surprised by the proposal, she secretly looked for another opportunity to finally be with Jide, as her friend Amina had explained to her the betrayal of Aunt and how much he had defended her from Eric. Elizabeth and Eric finally got married and lived happily ever after.